All right. Thanks so much, Laura and David, for having me as part of this event, and thanks everyone for coming to my talk. So I'm here to talk about the evolution of a virtual production specialist. And so when Laura and I were talking about what topic I should talk about, we realized that this virtual production is a field that's very new. Like, only in the last couple of years it's started booming. And so how did you prepare for a career that you didn't even know existed and didn't set out to do? It's a collision of so many different fields. Like, you've got visual effects, you've got film, systems, computer graphics, all these things coming together. And before this, it seemed like they were very separate worlds, and now they're all coming together. So my talk is kind of going through my career and the things that I picked up along the way and how that contributed to a career in virtual production. And this is just how I got here. Like anything in virtual production, there's a million ways to end up with the same result. So this is just my experience. So a bit about me. I'm currently a virtual production supervisor at Lux Machina, and I also lead the UK engine team for Lux. I've worked on shows such as House of the Dragon, The Mandalorian, Avengers, Ready Player One, and also a lot of other things like VR experiences, VR games like Archangel, and lots of commercials and different music videos as well. I'm also a member of VES and BAFTA Connect. So a quick word about Lux, in case you don't know who we are. We're a company that specializes in all sorts of film, TV, broadcast, live events, technology, and we design, operate, do software development, all sorts of interesting bits of technology. So how I got started was that I knew I was going to go into tech somehow. Like, both of my parents are software engineers. I grew up with computers everywhere, take them apart, put them back together, go to the fries clearance bin and build Frankenstein machines that lasted about a week. And I loved doing that kind of stuff. And I actually didn't think I was going to get into film because my parents only let me watch like the Disney animated cartoons. So I never saw a live action movie until I saw Star Wars at a friend's birthday party. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So then I didn't really know what VFX was, though. I just thought, oh, this is really cool, and like wanted to watch all the Star Wars. And then Pirates of the Caribbean came out, and I think there was like a behind the scenes of how they did the visual effects of the skeletons walking around, and they showed like effects artists taking like pieces of leather and like simulating the like dried dead flesh on the skeletons, and it's like, this is so cool. And that they were doing this all in software, and so you could see someone like tuning and control and then seeing it update and doing all the explosions and water effects and simulations. And so that was how I kind of discovered what VFX was and was like, this is what I want to do. Even though I was super into like sci-fi and all that, I was never into games. Like, I never thought I would work with the game engines for a living because I think I've worked on more games than I've played. So, I'm a terrible game developer. So when I went to school, I grew up in Texas. So there's not a lot of visual effects in Texas. There's quite a big film industry. Like, there's South by Southwest, which is a big film conference. But there weren't a lot of schools that were teaching VFX besides art schools. And my parents said, no, you have to go to a real university and get a real degree. So I ended up going to UT Austin because it was a state school. In the States, in state public schools are a lot cheaper. So even though I wanted to do film, I didn't think I could afford something like USC. And I ended up going to computer science. And even though I started out with computer science, I ended up getting a second major in film. Because the way that schools work in the US, you have like a core curriculum of classes and you need to pick a certain amount of hours in your subject. But you can take more than that instead of like following like a very regimented schedule. So I ended up testing out of all my core requirements, doing all the computer science classes, and then taking so many film classes that I ended up with 2 degrees. But what was great about it was that I learned like the basics of both of these disciplines that go into VFX. So computer science taught me a lot about logic and operating systems, low-level like computer science topics, even like electrical engineering, learning how to like what the switches and gates and how to program that kind of thing. There wasn't a lot of computer graphics classes at the school. There were a few where we made like a basic ray tracer. And there was one game development class, which was taught in Ogre. I don't know if anyone's ever used that, but it is a terrible system. And then film, which could not be more different from the computer science school. It was a lot more theory than like practical filmmaking. I did the digital media track, so it was more about working with like media files and all that, but also there was a lot of like studying film, learning how to read film and spot, like be able to look at a frame and like see meaning in it. And also learning about the history of film and how these tools developed. Also, I wanted to point it out that both majors were very, very male-dominated. I think there were 3 women in my graduating class for computer science out of 70. So I hope there are more women in STEM in the future and hope that more women get into it. So after a bachelor's, I went to Bournemouth University to do a master's because I wanted to get as far away from Texas as possible. So I ended up going to the UK and doing a master's in computer animation visual effects. And this was so different from the US school system because you had a class of people that you were with all the time and you had a schedule of like, this is your curriculum, unlike in the States where you're kind of picking and choosing your courses. It also felt a lot more practical. So like we concentrated heavily on like how to build tools and learning like compositing and the basics of various DCCs, how to write shaders, lots of Python scripting, and kind of applying that to VFX projects. Also focused mainly on fluid simulation because I still wanted to do explosions and water. So my thesis was on position-based dynamics for particle-based fluid simulation, which I think PBD is now what you use now in like Vellum and Houdini, and it's kind of a way of constraining a system so that's more stable. But after doing the master's, I realized that I was not really cut out for academics. I didn't like it that much, so I needed to find a job. So while I was in school, I was usually working as a freelance web developer, or I was working at the university building websites for professors. That's kind of how I worked my way through school. And then in Texas, I also worked for free for a local production company. I do everything from like driving and pick up equipment because I had a minivan that was really handy. And I would like shoot BTS for them. I think I even acted in one thing, but I'm not gonna share that. And but it was really useful because like kind of learning how a set worked and learning all the different roles, kind of learning what the gear is and picking them up and all that was a really useful experience. But my first real job was as a software developer for a financial software company. It was for a bank. that needed to run loan applications for car and mortgage applications. It was, I don't know, it was an all right job, but it taught me a lot because I learned how to work with a team in software development, like good software development practices, version control, and also I was doing both back-end and front-end, so learning how to do relational databases and program backends to things, setting up servers and testing my own software, and also working with QA to test software. And then also started working with REST APIs and being able to send commands to like different servers, which actually turned out to be really useful now because we use REST everywhere, like sending commands from the engine to various other devices for things like remote control is all using REST. And being able to customize our own tools has been really helpful. So even though I didn't think that web development would get me that far, it's actually like it's colliding more and more with what I'm doing now. So while I was working at the software company, I was tinkering with different things, and one day I came across Unity and found a tutorial for like how to make a game. And never really had worked with C# before, but it looked like an interesting and not terribly difficult language to learn, and started playing with that. And eventually ended up freelancing and working on Google Cardboard apps. This was kind of when like a lot of those VR apps and Google Cardboard and like Google Daydream were coming out. So I worked on several projects doing things like stereo conversion. Also was working with a producer in Vancouver, and he would do convert documentaries for projecting into domes. So I was making a way of previewing what the dome projection would look like, but doing that with the Google Cardboard and VR. And so that's how I kind of started playing around with game engines. And then eventually, I got a structure sensor. And that's like a depth sensor that you can attach to an iPad or iPhone. And it was meant for like 3D scanning and being able to scan different objects. But then I found like the SLAM tracking samples in it and started playing with those. And eventually wrote an app that takes that positional tracking data and then streams it back into an instance of Unity running on a desktop. So that was kind of my first step into virtual production, building this like cheap VCam basically. And it was interesting because back then a lot of like the tracking tools were outside in, so you needed an outside camera looking at a device and tracking it. And this was inside out, so it was the device tracking it and then streaming its position back out. So this was back in 2015, so it was kind of early stages for VCams. And this actually turned into a tool that got used on shows like Blade Runner 2049 and Greyhound. They were using it to fly cameras around and like preview what things would look like and scout locations. This also kind of got me into 3D printing because I was trying to make attachments to fit things onto the tablets, trying to make like handles or trying to attach this device in different configurations to minimize the offset and stuff like that. Which we actually use 3D printing a lot at Lux now, so that was a useful skill I didn't think would come up again. So I showed the virtual camera to a couple people, and that eventually got me a job working at Digital Domain in LA. And I started out doing commercials, making contents for live events or for, did a couple of VR projects as well. And we started out using Unity, but because Unreal was free, we ended up switching to Unreal. And so I kind of learned Unreal on the job. It was a pretty steep learning curve, but it was really interesting. And my first project was a VR installation for the Sci-Fi Channel at Comic-Con. And this was also my first time doing like room scale VR. So there's a lot of first things to figure out. It was an interesting project because they had filmed 2 live action performers in stereo and got the depth from it. And then we were using the depth to push and displace the footage so that it looked like they were in 3D, even though it was playing back a 2D video. So learned a lot about Unreal in that, and a lot about material graphs and blueprints, some C++, just kind of like dove headfirst into using Unreal. I also did some projects doing console games, so a PSVR game, which I don't really want to do console games again. It was such a pain, but it was a good experience. Eventually I joined the virtual production team. They've got a very large mocap volume in LA and Playa Vista, and that was the same team that had done Jungle Book, and they were doing Ready Player One. So that was my first experience working on a virtual production show on a feature. Most of the work that I was doing remote support for the tools. The team was actually shooting at Leavesden in the UK, but I was based out of LA. So a lot of working between time zones, troubleshooting things. And then eventually when they came back to LA for reshoots, I was one of the operators. So that was a bit intimidating, that being my first time ever operating a stage with Steven Spielberg in the room. So I hope I didn't mess anything up. But it was also, because it was a reshoot, it was a lot easier because I was recalling previous setups. So yeah, it was a kind of more friendly introduction into working on set, I guess. But at DD, I was there for almost 2 years and then got more into doing things like writing custom shaders, writing tools, building out more of the virtual production tools, especially things for like puppeteering and being able to drive animation and characters using tracked objects. It's kind of different to the virtual production that we think of now. Like, it's not like the ICVFX workflow, but it was a lot of visualizing things on set. So you're on a volume that is just white, basically, and then rendering out like a previs version of what the environment and the characters all look like live. So even though I love DD, I still wanted to do traditional VFX because that was what I set out to do, and I really wanted to do it. So I ended up going to DNEG in London, and I was on the Creature Effects R&D team. So I was mainly working in Heron Groom, which was really interesting because that showed me how the entire pipeline worked. And DNEG has a very extensive and built-out pipeline that's being used by thousands of artists on dozens of shows at any given time. So it's a very slow ship to turn, I think, and learning how to work with that, how to write code that would fix a problem but not break it for everyone else, and like how to do regression testing, and just working with such an extensive code library. Because the tool that we worked on was called Furball, and it was a proprietary procedural fur system, which plugged into Houdini and Maya. And so learning about how to write plugins for various DCCs, how to translate things between one DCC and another, and have it go through a whole pipeline where it starts out in build and then goes into groom and animation and rendering. So having to look after that entire pipeline of how this asset traveled through it. It taught me a lot about release cycles and how to manage software and versions on shows. and also how to handle like large amounts of data, because on a groom you're going to have hundreds and thousands of hairs. So how do you use that efficiently? And that was one of the projects that we worked on, was being able to take a groom from another vendor and bring it into this procedural system efficiently. Because before it was entirely procedural, so it generated each node evaluated every time. But being able to take a cached groom and then efficiently process all the attributes and do things like clumping and stuff, it saved a lot of time and also gave artists more flexibility to work in whichever groom package they wanted to. And most of this work was done for Avengers Endgame because Rocket came from a different vendor, and we had to match the look of Rocket on the previous Avengers movies. So I'm a big Marvel fan, so that was really cool. But after working with traditional VFX, I missed real time. I think I'm very impatient and didn't want to wait for things to evaluate anymore, so I wanted to go back to doing real-time stuff. So I went to the 3rd floor in LA as an AR/VR developer, and was working on a tool called Cyclops that was mainly used for The Mandalorian Season 2. This background is a frame from some of the assets that were in Cyclops. And it was cool because it was used as the on-set visualization tool. So you could see what a set extension looked like. You could see what characters look like. You could also do some simple, like being able to move them around, scout and bookmark cameras. And it all ran on an iPad. So it was very portable, and it was easy to send an iPad out to a set or send it to a director or VFX. And we also worked on a lot of tools to be able to efficiently package content so that you didn't need a dedicated app developer on every show just to be able to process the content. On The Mandalorian, I got to go see it being used on set, which is really cool, and I geeked out because I saw Baby Yoda and just fell in love. But it was actually like the worst conditions for AR because it was on a backlot in LA, like bright sunlight, which is absolutely terrible for tracking. There was not that much there for it to track because there's a large open space, which is why we needed AR to visualize what was going to go there. And also the iPad kept overheating. So you'd have to just duck it out into the shade whenever you could. It was my first time ever having to attach a thing to a camera, which is really intimidating. But it worked out pretty well, and we used it throughout the season. But the main sequence that we used it for was this crate sequence in the first episode. And got a video of what it looks like.
Many of the scenes being filmed today have digital characters or elements that filmmakers, crew, and actors need to envision. The 3rd floor's award-winning app, Cyclops, was developed to quickly view visual effects objects not otherwise easily represented on the set or location. Cyclops uses augmented reality and game engine tech to track and overlay CG assets with live video of the physical environment in real time.
So it's actually pretty cool working on Red Gun or House of the Dragon because we ran into Cyclops again. They used it for a thing called Video Viz and would go onto set and kind of have stand-ins act out a scene. And that was how they did previs on some of the sequences. So it was kind of interesting to see worlds colliding, seeing Cyclops again. So after the 3rd floor, so even though Cyclops was being used on Mandalorian and that was the ICVFX show, I didn't have anything to do with the ICVFX part of it. So then I had the opportunity to go to Net Studios in LA as an like engine operator, and so that was my introduction into a whole new world of virtual production. Like, I had never come across things like show programming or lighting or like LED processes and video matrices. That stuff was all new to me. And so I learned a ton there, a lot from Lux and Epic that did a great job of teaching us how everything worked and how to go about setting it up. It was also my introduction to like having to deal with color management because I hadn't really had to worry about that so much. It was just set your color space and then you're done for a lot of it. Or a lot of the real-time stuff is just sRGB. You didn't really have to worry about that too much. But now it's a whole new world of all the different places where you can set your color space on the processors, on the cameras, and your content. And that, to me, was just such a black box. And so I learned a lot at NET, especially working on things like the IC-VFX case study. We did several commercials, some music videos there, and kind of learned what it was like working on set, like during a commercial. And because I was operating, I was having to figure out and troubleshoot things very quickly, especially on commercials where they have a very short timeline. So knowing how everything worked was incredibly useful. Like, we had one day where half the cluster was working on the ceiling and only half was working on the walls. But we were doing a live event, so we couldn't really just go down and like take 10 and figure it out. So I ended up running half the cluster on the ceiling, freezing it, and then like going into the system and then changing some of the parameters so I could run the walls from the other cluster. And we managed to get through it. But I think just knowing how all these bits fit together, it helps you come up with a lot more creative solutions for problems. It may not be the best solution, but at least it works. But eventually I jumped over to Lux, and that's where I am now. So, like, when I was working mostly in VFX or like AR, all I had to really think about was like the bit that I was working on, the engine or like the Maya scene, for example. But suddenly there were a lot more pieces to be thinking about and knowing the status of all these things all the time. And especially becoming a supervisor, being able to talk to different people on set and communicate about these topics. Some of them are really technical and not exactly easy to explain. So, yeah, just a lot more things to think about. Also, working at Lux is a lot more. I've been working on set a lot more and having to deal with high pressure situations. There's always people gathering around the operator carts, looking over their shoulder, like waiting for their change to get made, and like, is it done yet? And being able to deal with that. And also being able to troubleshoot and write code really quickly. I thought it was really useful having like my experience building tools and writing code, because then it was a lot easier to see like, oh, this feature doesn't quite do what we want, but like this is how we can make it work for this shot. So a lot of live coding, like while we were on set. And then also just paying attention to all the different things going on, because there's so many different departments, there's so many bits of equipment, and there's so many places where things can go wrong. But also like knowing what to look out for, like if you see something that's about to become a problem, be able to flag that. And I really enjoyed working on set, and especially with such a great team. Like Lux team is here supporting, thanks guys. But just having a team that you can count on and like work really closely with for really long days and like not hate each other is really valuable. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that we did on House of the Dragon. I think this was from the second episode, and it was a really interesting environment because we used it in several different episodes in different lighting conditions, and the only actually physical set was this piece of bridge that was on wheels, and then we could turn it around and do the reverse. So I think I'll play a video of what it looked like. So a lot of the bridge work was all done in camera. And even when we did the buck work with the flying shots of her landing on the bridge, we brought up the CG environment again for lighting, even though we used blue screen in the background. So this was a really interesting environment to use, and I think you'll see it again in different places where they're at nighttime, like more of a dusk environment, and I think this environment worked really well. Another environment that we did was Storm's End, which is more of a full set build. So this one, they had like a full floor and the throne, and also it involved these pillars with big flames on them. So being able to do SFX and stuff in the volume was a really interesting challenge. We also used this environment in 2 different episodes as well, set several years apart. So it was really cool to see how like the volume can make it flexible for big set builds like this, and be able to switch quickly backwards or between them, and also how DPs approach lighting them differently because they were done by 2 different DPs. I'll just play a video of what this one looked like.
Storm's End was a volume set primarily because there does not exist a castle that looks like Storm's End outside or in.
We wanted to give those final 10 minutes of the show a particular look.
The eye patch coming off, because that'll give us a good chance to see that moment, then the thing, and then you grab it, scoop it back.
When we're producing ancient monuments, interiors with stone walls, it's a more tricky element to do convincingly.
You can put a set in that sort of semicircle, and I think the trick there obviously is where you merge reality of a hard set into those screens.
They're just looking through the lens and they're sort of lining up a shot, and you know, the beauty of it is they're able to line up that castle that otherwise wouldn't be there in the frame and really make that a part of their shot composition.
We made the stone throne and we made the benches, and then art department made the structures around the edge, and that was it really.
And until they put something up there, it's like, is this going to work? Is it going to make sense? And you put an image up there and you stand in the middle and look around and you kind of go, oh yes, I can see how this is going to work.
So we have a lot of very conveniently oval-shaped environments and a lot of convenient architectural features to help blend the scene. Like if you look at the bottom, there's like a bit of a step there. So that helps conceal where the joint is between the physical set and the virtual one. And then there's a lot of work doing color grading and blending to help make that even more seamless.
Storm's End was a volume set primarily.
And of course, there were a lot of dragons involved in this show. So a lot of what we did was buck work. So that involved motion base that was programmed with different movements. And then there was a wire cam that had been programmed as well. So we'd take the animations from the previous house, the 3rd floor, and then be able to bring them up on the volume as a marker for the camera operators to align to. We had tons of SFX on the buckwork as well, lots of wind, and eventually we did rain as well. But what was cool is that we were using the volume a lot for lighting, and depending on the shot, we would use different things for the backgrounds. Like, we had some where it was a static sky, some where we were playing back EXR sequences of pre-rendered skies, or sometimes we brought up the full CG environment. And then we were doing lots of interesting things with lighting to program light cards and physical lights, working really closely with the lighting desk op, who did an amazing job of making the lighting so dynamic and being able to do things like drive the lighting with the motion base and making all these pieces come together. So that was a lot of our time on House of the Dragon. That was just a quick video that one of the DPs took of what it looked like. So he's getting blasted with wind. There's these shower jets spraying water at him. And then we have this pre-rendered sky with light cards that are synced up to the physical lights to give this effect of the storm. So I guess looking forward, like even though I've gotten to like this stage of my career, there's always just so much to learn. Like I feel like I don't know anything. And then when I do know things, I'll talk to someone and realize I don't know anything. And the technology just evolves so quickly that it's hard to keep up sometimes. And also, like, besides just keeping on top of technology, also trying to help develop some more of it. So working more on R&D projects and coming up with solutions for different shows, because each show is going to have a whole new set of challenges and want to do something that no show has ever done before. So I think those are really interesting problems to look at. And also, just always trying to improve skills, like not just technical skills, but also trying to learn more about like management and leadership and trying to develop that area as well. And maybe someday get to work-life balance. So I guess to like sum up my talk, these are some of the takeaways that I hope people come away with. So mainly being, you don't have to go to a specific school or take a specific course to get into this field. People come into it from all different areas, like VFX, live events, camera operation. Like, there's so many different ways to get into this. And I think what's the most important is knowing the fundamentals and how all these things work. Like good coding practices or like best practices for building assets. You don't need to know everything or have to do everything yourself. Like, I can make a model, but it won't be pretty. But I do know how to tell someone, like, you should build it this way, and these are things that you need to look out for. And it doesn't really matter which DCC you're learning either. There's definitely ones that are more common, like Maya, Unreal, that are useful to know, and like Houdini. But like the principles are the same across all of them. Same with programming languages. Like, you probably most commonly use Python and C++, but if you know one language and know how to code in one, it's fairly easy to pick up another language. And even if something doesn't sound like it'll be directly related to your career, you never know, it could come up. So kind of being a bit of a jack of all trades is actually a really useful skill in this field. And another thing that was really important is networking. So every job that I've gotten has been from someone that I knew and had worked with, and they recommended me. So networking, get your name out there, talk to different people, and maintain connections. That's really important. And also just being curious, being flexible, like try different things. Try not to just say no to something because you don't think it'll work, or like without giving it a try first. So yeah, that's my talk, and thanks so much, you guys, for listening.
Thank you. That's amazing to hear. Really great. So we have time for questions. And if anyone's in our live stream watching that has questions, just post them in the chat. I'm curious, with all these different skills and environments you've worked in, do you find yourself either craving some new environment or narrowing more specifically as you mature in virtual production?
I think one of the things I like about virtual production is that there's so many different bits to it. There's so many different areas to work in, and that works out really well for me because I tend to get bored if I'm stuck doing one thing for a very long time. I think that was part of the reason I left doing Groom, because I was just doing Groom, and it was such a specific thing, and that's all I did. And so I think there's so much more to explore in virtual production, different tools, lots of things that I've worked with but don't know that much about, so I want to dig deeper into those.
We'll get a microphone here.
Thank you for that. It was super interesting. I'm interested in something that you said at the beginning about there being a lack of women in the industry, or it being a boys' club when you started. Obviously, you've done amazing things. During your time, has there been any specific organisations or groups to help gender minorities get into this line of work so that it does actually become a visible thing in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of support for women that are looking into getting into these industries, especially you see a lot of like women in STEM kind of initiatives, things like Access VFX, Women in Animation, Animated Women UK. I did a program with them while I was at DNEG that was kind of like a course for women at different stages in their VFX careers and getting mentorship and stuff like that. I think there's so many like meetups and things like that as well for people trying to get together and chat about how things are going, kind of get more support that way.
Jarwin back here. Your career was pretty, it's amazing. Like you've jumped from so many different places, you've been able to grow. When you were talking at the beginning about like, you're starting in a career in an industry that just started, so it's hard to talk about the history of it. What do you have to say, or how have you guys on your team on set helped people who are literally starting on set now? Like your path has been short, but it's still been through DNEG and all these huge places. So what about a 23-year-old who's coming on set in Leavesden for the first time? Like how do you support them and allow them to grow as it changes every week?
Yeah, so I think right now is a really good time to get into this industry. Like there's such a shortage of talent in virtual production and VFX. And I think that people are always really open to answering questions. Like we train juniors, show them how things work. Like most of the stuff that we do day to day, we learn on the job anyways. So passing along that information and giving people opportunities to like show what they can do. And also recognizing that people come from all different backgrounds. Like we're not just looking at game development schools, we're not just looking at film schools, we're looking at like people with all sorts of different talents, and everyone has really complementary skill sets to each other.
Anyone else? Great. Oh, yeah, please. No, we have time. Let's do another question, please.
Hi, that was fantastic. Is there any advice that you would give to parents, in a way, because you started this conversation saying that your parents refused to let you go to art school, and I guess I'm curious about what they think of what you're doing now, and are there ways that we can get to the parents of the future students that are wanting to go to art school?
Yeah. I don't think my parents really got what I wanted to do. When I said I wanted to do VFX, they're like, oh, you're just gonna be like replaced by a computer and like you won't have a job in 5 years, so you should not do that. But I think it took until like they started seeing my name in credits and stuff and like showing them like, this is what I actually do, and like I'm writing code and it's like I still do computer science and like the things that they wanted me to do, but just in a different way and like the way I'm interested in doing it. And I think at the time I kind of was upset with my parents for like saying that you'll never make it in film and no, you can't go to art school. But I think that they supported me so much into going into tech and like encouraging me to like tinker with machines and like try all these different things. So I think it worked out. I think parents being open to what kids want to do and like seeing what they're interested in, what they're gravitating towards, and maybe not trying to push them in just one direction, letting them explore their interests.
Oh, we can have time for one more. Let's do it.
Hi, it's an amazing talk. Thank you. And it's great to see these high-level projects. What I was wondering, how much of your in-camera VFX shoots still go through a post-processing, a post-production process? And if so, is it just grading, or do they all still require a lot of work in post-production? Because in-camera VFX, it should be ready when it was shot, but like we all know that's not really the case. So it's interesting to find out how much of these projects that you've worked on have gone through a process like that.
Yeah, I think one day we want to be able to capture everything in camera, but I think right now there's still quite a bit of post work on it. There's usually some type of cleanup, like artifacts, or like if you're shooting against the ceiling, you'll probably have like a join between the wall and the ceiling, color correction, and also just adding like more effects to it. I think hopefully one day we'll get to the point where we can actually do all of it in camera, but I think ICVFX, it gets you most of the way there, or like does like the big strokes of it, and then you can do more cleanup in post.